Hey everybody, what's going on? It's Dave the Klone back once again with another installment of 15 minutes of movie memory madness on the Hollow9ine Network. Thank you for tuning in. If you're watching us on YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe so that you don't miss any of the movie memory madness from this mentally deranged madman movie aficionado, otherwise known as Dave the Klone. And it's, that interesting lull period of time now after the holiday season where we're kind of like, is it still okay to watch Christmas movies? Or are we supposed to go back into, alright, it's the new year, new gear, let's, shift gears away from holiday movies and start watching degular movies, I guess, if you want to call them that, to steal a phrase from a podcast I listen to, but will not promote, because they don't need it from me. In fact, they need to help me out. In any case, it was an interesting cut this week because in the holiday spirit, I try to watch a little bit of the usual holiday movies, like, we talked about Scrooge, we talked about Die Hard. We didn't talk about Christmas Carol, although I guess I did wrap that into the Scrooge conversation, but there are a few that tend to pop up that are a little bit on the, off the beaten path a little bit, I guess, when you think of holiday movies. And anybody who watched our 2021 holiday video from the Hollow9ine Network will remember that I, in my list of favorite holiday movies, mentioned a little film called The Mothman Prophecies from 2022. And in fact, it is coming up on its 22nd anniversary this month, so it's kind of serendipitous that I wound up watching this movie every day for like the last 2 weeks of the year, because one, it's not always available streaming. I think right now it's on Stars, which I've got through Prime. So the little 6 degrees of how do you watch a movie going on there. And when it does come on, I tend to throw it on as it's definitely one of my comfort food movies for sure. And I don't really know how it got to be that way. Maybe it is because I feel like it's such a treat when it is available to watch. And I do tend to forget until I'm starting to think about holiday movies that it's a movie that takes place on/around Christmas. Technically, it's classified as a horror movie. I don't know how I feel about that classification. We'll get into it as we get into the nitty-gritty here. But basically, it's I think, an incredible case study. We've got director Mark Pellington directing a script written by Richard Hatem, based on the book by John A. Keel of the same title. And it is all actually, the book is actually a researched, well thought out, it's not necessarily a fiction novel, whereas the movie is sort of like, I think one critic I saw on Wikipedia described it as an extended X-Files type episode of a show, kind of delving into this phenomenon. Also based on true events, so that's something to keep in mind as well. I've also seen some hate online. In particular, there's a friend of mine on Facebook who's, I think, pretty much an expert on the real-life phenomenon of the Mothman. And there's also on Amazon Prime, I believe, there's a sort of one of these kind of entertainment-driven pseudo-documentaries called The Mothman Legacy that delves into more of the bona fide facts about this actually occurring, actually has been seen by people in real life, sort of like the movie, the story of the movie. And it's kind of it's an interesting thing. I don't know, some people classify it as a demon, other people classify it as sort of like an alien. The movie doesn't really put a stake in the ground on either side of those explanations. It really more kind of puts it in the sense of there are forces of nature that we as humans don't fully understand and possibly aren't meant to fully understand. In fact, the sort of in movies like this, the story follows a reporter from Washington, D.C. named John Klein, played by Richard Gere, The movie stars Richard Gere, Laura Linney, Debra Messing, Will Patton, and I believe there's someone else who I'm forgetting, but we'll probably remember as we go further in here. But those are the 4 heavy hitters. Those are the 4 big ones. There's other familiar faces in there, but those are the 4 mains that we spend the most time with. And the movie starts with Richard Gere's character, John Klein, meeting his wife, Debra Messing, to go, and he's leaving work. It's the holiday party at his job. I forget what newspaper he works for. I don't even think they tell you. Washington Post. Never mind. Sorry. He works for the Washington Post. It's movie memory madness, guys. Sometimes the memory is a little all over the place. I hope you have your water cooler water or your damn fine cup of coffee and you're able to wake up as I wake up through this conversation. And they go and they're house hunting, and they're looking and they find this house. We see them kind of celebrating a little early as they start making out in the closet when they decide they're going to buy it. And then on the drive home, Debra Messing is driving. Why can't I think of her name all of a sudden? IMDb to the rescue. John Klein. And what was his wife's name? Mary. It's always easy to forget the normal names, right? And she's driving, and she sees something come flying at the windshield. And the visual is kind of almost like a late 90s, early 2000s CG of what almost looks like a bat with a little bit of a humanoid face. Definitely some eyes that are very easy to make out. And it's if it flies super fast and hits the windshield. And because she sees this, she kind of panics and loses control of the car. And we see her hit her head against the driver's side passenger, door window. And the accident isn't what winds up bringing her to her untimely demise, but because of going to the hospital to get checked out after the accident, they discover that she has glioblastoma, which is a brain tumor, and she winds up passing away. And then the movie does a quick time cut to 2 years later, but John Klein really is in a bad place mentally and emotionally as a result of his wife's passing. He's still able to hold it together at work, but, his buddy at work is trying to set him up with people, and they're trying to get him to break out of the depression. And he winds up, blowing off some plans that his friend was trying to make, and he's heading down to Virginia to interview a political candidate. I think it was a political candidate who's going to be eventually running for president, possibly. He's a governor at the moment. And so, DC to Virginia to Richmond, it's a couple hours. It's not supposed to be, going to another planet or anything. But somehow, in the course of his drive, and he can't explain this, he winds up in West Virginia on the border of Ohio in a town called Point Pleasant. And his car breaks down. And when his car breaks down, he hoofs it to the nearest house, and he knocks on the door, asks if he can use the phone because he doesn't have. This is pre everybody having a cell phone and a smart device and a billion different ways to be able to call for help, which I find refreshing watching movies from that period of time, because now they always have to come up with some contrivance of I'm in a bad coverage zone. I have no signal. I can't use my phone. This was I don't even have a phone. This was I'm going to find a house and ask them if I can use their phone. It's almost a little True Detective-ish in a way. And upon answering the door, he's met by Gordon Cole, played by Will Patton, who immediately pulls a shotgun on him and says it's him. And he says, "Get in here, I've been waiting for you." And he's got Richard Gere in the shower at gunpoint, and they're waiting for the police to show up. And the police show up in the form of Laura Linney playing Officer Connie Mills, and she's not the police chief, but she's a high-ranking police officer, and she's kind of like the vox populi for the non-victims of the Mothman in this movie. And one of the things we kind of glossed over is that when his wife passed away, we see Richard Gere, we see John Klein packing up all of his wife's belongings to take out of the hospital, and he finds this notebook. And there are all these kind of crazy drawings, and this was kind of a theme. This became, I don't know if Mothman kicked it off, but there was a point in time where all movies, it was sort of Blair Witchy too, in a way, to call back one of our earlier episodes. But, you know, there was always this thing where you would find, after somebody passed away, you'd find their notebook or you'd find their journal, and it's full of all these, like, really creepy drawings and drawings of, like, red eyes and sort of like, clearly one of them is the sort of bat-like shape of what hit the car when she was driving, and then others are kind of like faces within the shadows, lots of like dark lines with a face peering through. And as he's looking at it, an orderly kind of comes by and says, "She was drawing angels, she knew she was gonna die." And, you know, John Klein looks over, sees him, looks back at the notebook, looks up again, and that guy's gone. Well, okay, keep that in mind, because, you know, police show up, she sees this guy being held at gunpoint in this other dude's shower. She talks everybody down. John Klein shows her his ID and that he's a reporter and from DC, and, you know, she gets the guy to, you know, release him and tells him to not pull guns on people anymore. And as they're driving, she says, you know, I could take you to a motel and we'll get your car towed in the morning. And he's asking her, you know, are these people crazy? Have you ever had any issues with them before? And she goes, nah, but, you know, there's been a little bit of weirdness going on lately. People all over town are kind of seeing strange things and lots of spooky stories being reported. So, you know, it's not so out of the out of the realm of reasonability for me for something weird like this to be happening. And you know, the next day comes along. He goes to get his car looked at. The mechanic can't find anything wrong with his car. And she even remarks to him, she goes, "What were you doing out here?" He goes, "Oh, I don't know, I'm just passing through." And she says, "But we're not on the way to anywhere." And this is, you know, before she takes him to the motel. And when he gets to the motel, there's a map on the countertop, and he asks the motel manager, where are we? And he's like, "We're right on the state line with Ohio." And he realizes he would have had to drive several hours to get there. So this is already kind of one of these X-Files-y, like, I've lost time and I'm someplace I shouldn't be, and it shouldn't have been physically possible for me to get there. He starts to kind of develop a friendship with the police, because the next night he goes back to kind of stake out the front of Gordon's house, because Gordon claims that Richard Gere had shown up 3 nights in a row prior to him actually being there himself, and knocked on the door and says that his car broke down and he needs to use the phone. Now this is where we start to collect a whole bunch of stories from characters in this town of these weird types of things. And the police, you know, Connie takes him to the police station, and as she's telling him about all these, like, weird stories that people are, you know, coming in and telling her about, she goes, you know, these aren't the town drunk, these aren't the town speed freaks, these are good, honest, God-fearing people coming in and telling me about monsters in their yard. She goes, you know, I do what I can to calm people down, but what can you do when someone says they saw that in their backyard? And she shows him a picture from the file, and it looks remarkably like one of the drawings that his wife had done in her journal in the hospital. So the movie becomes kind of like an investigative thing, where they go and they're interviewing all these people, and they're finding, you know, he finds like burn marks in trees where this thing was supposed to have been seen, and it reminds him of a burn mark he found on the outside of the car when he was sort of retracing the steps of the car accident that he and his wife were in. And so this movie is very it's subtle. It's not like an overt, we don't really see a lot of the monster. It's always in these kind of quick, really MTV stylistically kind of shot glimpses, and it's always during a flashback of somebody recalling their experience when they witnessed it. And so I kind of never thought of it as a monster movie, But I do remember the first time I ever watched it, I was home alone. It was 2002. I was home alone visiting during my final year of college. Like, I was on holiday break and I hadn't gone back yet. And I was the only one in the place, you know, in the apartment. Everybody else was out, and it was a very gloomy, drab January day, you know. And I remember thinking while I was watching the movie, like, oh yeah, this is a cool movie and everything. But then as soon as it was over, I was suddenly very aware of being alone. And a lot of what the people in the movie described, like when they would see the Mothman, you usually just see the red eyes kind of staring at you from the darkness. And this one woman talks about she was getting ready to go to bed, and she just happened to walk past the window and look up and saw the red eyes looking at her. And she said, you know, they're walking around outside during the day, showing where it was. And she goes, it was there, so it was right next to that tree branch, so it must have been like 8 or 9 feet tall, and it just stared at me, and I couldn't look away, but I was terrified. And after a few moments of that, it just kind of took off and flew away. And it's like those kinds of, and you know, coupled with the sound effects and the music done by Tom and Andy, which is a sort of, you know, in an era of like bands like Garbage, where you had like music producers coming together and creating these kind of experimental bands. Tom and Andy have done music for quite a few very sort of atmospheric horror films, including The Strangers and the Billy Crudup, Jennifer Connelly movie Waking the Dead. And it was just like, it all comes together to create this atmosphere. And I think that's what this movie is, kind of like a masterclass in creating an atmosphere, because it's very quiet. A lot of the dialogue is very quiet. There's not a lot of screaming. There's not a lot of running around chasing monsters, running around being chased by monsters. It's all like a slow X-Files episode. And it's all, and a lot of it is also being kind of affected by the fact that not only was he not fully over his wife's death, but the sort of emergence of these things that his wife was drawing in her notebook when she was in the hospital, starting to now be seen by all the people in this small town in West Virginia. It's kind of got him thinking about his wife a lot, and feeling like, well, this is something to do with why she died, what happened to her when she died. In fact, when he's with her in the hospital, when she first comes to after the accident, she's all, you know, on alert, very, you know, feeling unsafe and like looking around her, you know, and she says to him, "You didn't see it, did you?" You know, and he doesn't know what she was talking about. He assumed it was sort of like a hallucination as a result of the brain tumor, but now it's becoming a real thing. And so, you know, he's got her picture up in the corner of the mirror at the motel room. One of the things that this entity is notorious for, especially with the town fire chief, is it makes phone calls. You'll get these weird phone calls that are just noise or unintelligible gibberish. He runs into Gordon, Will Patton's character, in town while he's, you know, running errands and stuff, and Gordon starts to tell him, like, hey, you know, this weird thing happened last night. I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom with the worst headache I've ever had in my life, and I go to the bathroom to get some aspirin, and I'm looking in the mirror, and I see something looking back at me that I've never seen before, and then I hear this howl coming from the sink, and inside the howl is a whisper saying, "Do not be afraid. 99 will die. Denver 9. And, you know, they just think, oh, that's pretty weird. And so they leave there. This is like they're in a hardware store talking about this. Then they're outside the store, and John looks over and he goes, "Hey, Gordon, your ear is bleeding." So he immediately goes to the doctor. And this is one of those things in movie world where you're like, would this really happen? And, you know, Richard Gere is at the doctor with him. John Klein's at the doctor with him, and so is his wife. And the doctor says, you know, everything looks clear. We did a CAT scan. We did a CT scan. Everything's fine. I think you just had like a world-class migraine. And Gordon is very put off by all of this because, you know, at first he he thought that the Richard Gere's character was sort of just stalking them for some odd reason, but once this whole thing started with he's investigating all these other weird occurrences, and now the occurrences are happening to him, he seems to be like one of these people that becomes an instant believer of something bigger going on. And so, you know, Gordon and his wife and John all go to this diner, and while they're sitting there talking, John Klein looks up at the TV, because this diner's got a TV playing, and it's like up in the corner, almost the way like a bar would have a TV. And he just gets up from the table and slowly walks over, and Will Patton's character Gordon turns and follows, and they're all looking at the screen now, and on the screen is a news story. Flight 9 out of Denver has crashed, and all 99 people and crew aboard have been killed. And so one of the things that this entity does is it starts kind of predicting catastrophes. Now, John Klein is doing all kinds of research, and he finds out about this author in Chicago named Alexander Leek, and I think that Leek, L-E-E-K, is supposed to be an anagram or a sort of personification of the original book's author, John Keel, K-E-E-L. And so John Klein, Richard Gere, goes to Chicago to talk to him, and this guy doesn't even want to talk about it. He's like, leave me alone. And as it turns out, he was a physics professor at Cornell, and he started hearing voices, and at first he thought he was going crazy, and the voices started to make predictions, and these predictions started to come true, and he tried to warn people of these impending disasters because of these predictions he was getting. And as you would imagine, if this were happening to somebody in real life, the people immediately suspected him of being behind the catastrophes, because no one would believe that a otherworldly entity was was trying to, you know, forecast or warn, if that's even what they're doing. The movie doesn't really ever land on whether or not they're causing the events, or whether they're just or whether they're trying to warn you about the events. It's sort of like the way this Alexander Leek character talks about it, is he says, you know, it's almost like the buildup of energy before a storm. It's like a natural phenomenon. And he's like, it's just a part of nature. You know, these things appear in cave paintings from thousands of years ago. And he tells John Klein to just let all of this go. Forget about it. You'll never understand. He goes, I was hospitalized for 4 years and investigated, and I had the voices recorded. I had recordings of the voices, you know, so what do you think you're going to be able to make sense of something and you can't? And I love there's this one moment where they're walking, and he says, you know, if these things are so advanced, why don't they just come out and talk to us? And he goes, you're more advanced than a cockroach. Do you ever try and talk to one? And then he says, well, why are they even bothering you? Are they God? You know, what is this? And he goes, look up on that building. He goes, the window washer all the way up there, if there's a car accident 10 blocks away, he could probably see it. Now, that doesn't mean he's God. It just means he can see a little further down the road. And it's just like, I love this sort of everything just kind of being left up in the air. You're left to kind of interpret what you think. Ultimately, he does start getting predictive messages saying that there's going to be some great tragedy on the River Ohio. And he seems to think it's surrounding the politician who he was originally traveling to Virginia to interview, touring a chemical plant that's on the Ohio River. And he winds up, you know, we do see a brief moment of John becoming Alexander by trying to warn him and trying to tell him to stay away from the plant, and not having any real credible reason to say why he has concerns. And, you know, you do immediately start to see, they're like, oh man, this guy's losing his mind. And he's already been, you know, like his boss is pissed because he's been gone for over a week. He was only supposed to be gone for a day or two. His buddy at work is trying to understand what it is he's investigating, and a lot of the investigation is still being driven by the fact that he thinks he's going to get some answers about his wife, or be able to maybe even speak to his wife. There's a moment where he's in bed tossing and turning in the motel, and when he turns over, his wife is there, and she's looking at him and saying, you know, I'm sorry, I feel like I ruined everything, I want you to be happy. You know, like, there's this whole real creep factor about it. And I think that's where a lot of the movie's strength lies, in this sort of atmosphere of the quiet, cold isolation of obsession mixed with an intellect that's tainted with just a little bit of madness because of the emotions that we have as people. And yeah, I often recommend this movie, especially to people who haven't even heard of it, because I feel like it's one of these things that was like a literal sleeper. I think it didn't have horrible reviews, but it didn't do incredibly well at the box office, and even in its release after the fact, it was like it was the cult following of fans like me, I guess, who would push it on their friends. But everybody I've ever watched it with, everybody I've ever sort of said, hey, we should check this out, they were always like, man, that movie was awesome. And I'm like, yeah, right? And I don't know, I don't remember, I guess I kind of remember the advertising campaign. You know, getting ready to record this, I went on YouTube and I was looking up the trailer, and I was watching all the old TV spots, and I did, as I was watching them, remember, I'm like, yep, I definitely remember. I didn't see it in the movies though, so it's ironic that I remember the promos, but they didn't compel me to go and check it out in its theatrical release. I definitely, and it's weird, so maybe this was right after I graduated that I watched it, because it wasn't released on DVD until June of 2002, which is pretty quick. I think that was at that time where there was a time, I don't know anybody out there listening if you're old enough to remember this time, when a movie would be in the theater and then it would take over a year before it was available, you know, even just to rent. VHSs weren't always, and that was the format before DVD, folks. And I know there's some people out there who don't even remember when it was DVDs. They started at Blu-ray and went straight to streaming, and don't understand why people like me like physical media. And it's because of stuff like this. Like, I'm probably only so stoked about Mothman Prophecies right now is because it's streaming again. I had to dig out my DVD and make sure I take it with me everywhere when I'm traveling so that I can watch it, provided I'm traveling with a device that can play discs. But yeah, there was a time where if a movie came out in the theater, it would be like over a year before it would be available to rent. And right around the early 90s, 92, 93, when movies like T2 were coming out, I think Jurassic Park might have been one of the first ones where, you know, before Jurassic Park came out and it was available for like $20 at the grocery store, and everybody was able to buy that and take that home. But like T2, when that first came out on VHS, or Batman, 1989 Batman, Michael Keaton, that was like $100 for the tape. You know, the only people who could afford it were video rental places, and that was because they were going to make that money back by renting the tapes out. You know, VHSs were not priced to own. They were priced to rent. So it was like a secondary market for the studios to make an additional revenue off of the movies after they left the theater. And it wasn't until the early 90s, the mid 90s, where it was sort of like everything started to become available. And it's funny because I feel like I wasn't as aware of that phenomenon as it was happening until like Jurassic Park. I remember you would go to the grocery store and there'd be an end cap with a whole bunch of VHS tapes, and you're like, why is a grocery store selling videos? Anyway, it's a long-winded way to say that, you know, this movie came out in January, and I definitely remember seeing it while I was in college, or maybe right after college. You know what it is? I had a girlfriend in college who came to visit in New Jersey not long after college was over, for me anyway, and that was graduating in 2002. So this was my graduation year. Didn't see the movie in the theaters, rented it when I got home, and then when this ex-girlfriend came to visit, I re-rented it around Christmas time the following year, or actually the end of the year, 2002. So Ironic. Ironic that it's a movie that takes place around the holidays. I used to watch it around the holidays a lot. I think it was maybe Thanksgiving when I rented it. So I always put it on my list of, if you want to watch something, then it's not the Charlie Brown Christmas special, and it's not A Christmas Carol, and it's not National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, but it is technically a Christmas movie. Then I always throw out the Mothman Prophecies. I throw out the Ref with Dennis Leary, but that's more. I think that's a little bit closer to a traditional Christmas movie, as opposed to this, which is, according to all sources, according to IMDb, according to Wikipedia, a horror movie. And I guess it is. I mean, we're talking about a demonic entity. We're talking about otherworldly beings. We're talking about forces of nature beyond those that we would understand. We're talking about what would be like a Christmas episode of The X-Files. But there's a lot of Christmas imagery that goes on in the movie. There's even a very sort of pivotal moment for the character, for John Klein, for Richard Gere, where he's back in D.C. and Laura Linney, Connie, is trying to get him to come back down to West Virginia, and she's like, come on, it's Christmas, you don't want to be alone on Christmas Eve. She's like, I booked you a flight, and I'll understand you do what you have to do, but we'd love to see you. And around here, we have dinner at 7, or we have dinner at 6, and we open presents at 8. And it's sort of like one of those things that, like, it doesn't even take you out of the movie. It almost makes the movie hit in a different way, strike a chord in a different way. Because, as I've mentioned in other episodes talking about movies that are around the holidays, like when you're little, the holidays automatically have this whole magic thing going on, and it's supposed to be like everything's happier, everything's nice, everybody's more in love if you're in love, everybody's more at home if you're at home. And this movie twists those a little bit. There's a lot of sadness with Richard Gere's character because of the holidays. When his wife first is diagnosed with her illness, like, there's Christmas lights on all the houses when they're driving, and so it brings that more adult harshness of reality that hits you later in life to the forefront. In fact, there's a part during the middle of the movie when the sightings are beginning to increase in volume and in frequency, and the town is having their lighting of their big Christmas tree in the middle of town, and like the Christmas music, it sounds like it's off key, and like everybody's kind of not as cheery as they should be, and it really just adds again to the atmosphere. This movie is a mastercraft in atmosphere. There's like a few little jump scares, and it's all because of things like reflections and mirrors and things like that. And so really cool movie. I don't understand, one of the people that I'm friends with on Facebook who doesn't like the movie and often will complain and say, oh, here, typical Hollywood, not even doing the barest of research to know what it's talking about with this movie. It's not even getting the whole lore of the Mothman right. And I'm like, well, for me, I'm not a paranormal expert. I don't need it to be to the letter of the of the latest authorities' research paper on what this thing could be. For me, it was a really entertaining movie, and anything that's based on true events that has stuff like this going on, it falls into this weird pantheon of, you're like, okay, so we have that story, they made a movie about it. Has this thing appeared anywhere else since? Is it going to appear anywhere else? Like, when's the next Mothman sighting going to be? So that's something fun to leave y'all with. Have you seen it? Do you love it? Is it on your list of movies to watch around the holidays? Let me know. Please leave some comments below, or you can email us at hollow9podcast@gmail.com. That's the word hollow, the number 9, INE, podcast, all one word, at gmail.com. Again, make sure you hit the like and subscribe so every time we release a new episode, you're made aware, and enjoy that damn fine cup of coffee and the last drops of your water cooler water before you get back into the swing of things. And thanks for stopping by. I'll see you guys next time at the movies.
You've been listening to the Hollow9ine Network, bringing you the very best in fan-made media. That's the word hollow, the number 9, I-N-E. Find the Hollow9ine Network on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat. Rate and review us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. Email us at hollow9podcast@gmail.com. Leave us your feedback. Join in the conversation and be a part of the action. Join in the fun. Hollow9ine.